Thank you again to Dr. Shirley Weber for those opening remarks about blessed struggle and the time for bold ideas. Again, what a beautiful setup for this next session. My name is Lisa Hu. I use she, her, hers. As Mercedes said, I'm a climate equity analyst, artist, and performer, and I am thrilled to moderate this next session, which is so close to my heart, titled How Narratives Build Movements. Especially this past year, but also these last 4 years, we have seen the power of words and images, faces and voices, headlines and stories to shift conversations at the local and national levels, as well as the ability to actually change not just policies, but hearts and minds. If I close my eyes and reflect on this decade of a year, I see Stacey Abrams, of course. I hear Senator Raphael Warnock describing how his mother, whose hands once picked someone else's cotton, this year got to pick her son to be the first ever Black US Senator from the state of Georgia. Here in Oakland, I'm remembering seeing the shuttered and boarded up windows of small businesses and community centers, including the Green Lining building, and then witnessing the transformation of our entire downtown into a living, breathing, outdoor art gallery, thanks to artist activists offering love letters and pleas and beautiful messages of solidarity to our community in the hardest of times. I'm also thinking of the powerful work organizers have done to push back and correct the record, where the media and journalists and politicians have tried to tell the wrong story for their own purposes. From the vilification of Black Lives Matter protesters as violent looters to the undercutting of calls to defund the police. I'm thinking especially about how the initial framing of anti-AAPI violence pitted the AAPI community against the Black communities, and how strongly and lovingly and powerfully AAPI and Black communities rejected that narrative that someone else created for us. The real story we know is that when people have what they need, we are all safer. Public safety and community safety must mean more than policing. I'm moved by the organizers and historians and academics who reminded us that our communities have worked together before in multiracial solidarity, and we will continue to do so. The power of coming together and rejecting the systems that divide us signals a profound narrative flip and underscores why it is urgent for us to tell and own our own narratives. So this session, I have the privilege of being joined by incredible speakers who will each help us work through specific dimensions of these big questions. Why is it imperative for us to own our own narratives? What becomes more possible when we do, and what does that look like? And ultimately, how do narratives build movements? We will talk about the history of erasure and necessity of storytelling, the role of media and journalism in shaping the narratives we hear and experience every day, and finally, the role of arts and culture to activate social change and catalyze entire movements to spark the next wave of change. So to get us started, we're so excited to bring our next speakers up to the stage, Kyra Kyles and Primo Lagaso Goldberg, both of YR Media, formerly known as Youth Radio. As they come up, I will give brief intros for the two of them. Kyra Kyles, CEO of YR Media, is a 20-year veteran of the media industry and passionate advocate for youth voice. As an expert in diversity and representation who's previously served as editor-in-chief at Ebony and a pop culture columnist for the Tribune Company, Kyra is helping to create pathways for young people to drive the national conversation and ultimately take their seat at the table as leaders in media, tech, and creative industries. Primo Lagaso Goldberg is a youth journalist at YR Media, a multimedia creative, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, and current high school student based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So welcome to the virtual stage, Kyra and Primo.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So good to see both of you. Well, Kyra, let's start with you. This session is about narratives and movements. So please kick us off. How do you see the power of media and journalism in shaping conversations?
Well, I think media and journalism has the most impact. I mean, if you think about it, I've seen studies that say things like 3/4 of white Americans do not have friends that are people of color. So the way that they are meeting and encountering people of color is through the media, and that's from journalism to Hollywood And so because of that weight, the fact that we're not meeting each other, that we live in a segregated space, what we say about one another and the way we describe one another really matters. And because we do not have newsrooms yet, and we don't have Hollywood boardrooms yet that mirror our actual society, what we're getting is like a white, very male-centric view of other communities. And I love what you brought up earlier, Lisa, when you said the difference isn't just describing people. Like, people weren't protesting for justice, they were rioters, or they were damaging buildings, or they were putting stores at risk. And I think just that framing right there is a good example of how we have to fight back against that. Another thing I would say is just the appearance of people of color. You know, you watch local news, and that's where I actually started out, and your hair has to be straight. You know, you have to look a certain way. You have to try to talk a certain way. And the fact that we still see this in 2021, when we have cars that can drive themselves and people that are commissioning private rocket ships to space, is just a real mess. I mean, it feels almost, you almost feel defeated because it's such a circular battle, but it's also proof that we cannot stop fighting, because again, this is how we are meeting one another, through the media. So if we're looking through a blurred lens, or we're looking through an unclear lens, we will not be able to move forward.
Yes, thank you so much for that framing, Kyra, and absolutely to the way that our society is segregated. And I love this point about media then can be this intermediary, right? This place where we are meeting each other. And therefore, it's so important that the representations we see of ourselves are accurate for ourselves and also for others who are learning about us, right? So Kyra, let's dig in. This next question is a doozy, but I'm actually so excited. So coming off of the last administration, right, we saw countless ways that media and journalists enabled hateful rhetoric and incited violence. And consequently, we've seen an erosion of trust in mainstream media outlets. And then last year, with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests last summer after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many more continuing to today, we see how many industries are grappling with a semblance of a racial reckoning, right? Perhaps performative or clumsy or insufficient, but some kind of a reckoning nevertheless. How have you seen the media and journalism industry grapple with a racial reckoning of its own, if at all? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, you know, this is a somewhat of a sore topic for me, because I'm not seeing that. I am not seeing this real grappling. I think what we're seeing is some surface kind of, we need to do better, but that's the same thing that I've been hearing for the past 20 years as a journalist. It's the same conversation that I've been having at conferences. We have to diversify, but we just don't know anyone. Or we have to diversify, but young people have to be better prepared. No, they do not. You know, they're perfectly prepared. You're not prepared. And I think what's important is that we don't center that conversation of effort being equal to, you know, you getting applause. Like, you should not be applauded for trying to be diverse. And I think what you're seeing in the media, these headlines, from the framing of issues to the headlines, you really get a good look at how inequitable our society is. And it's like an echo chamber. It's people, you know, who are not of color, people who are not from marginalized communities, speaking about these groups as if they know, but just not going far enough as to actually invite them into the conversation and to steer the conversation. Because it's one thing to hire someone and just have them in your staff picture, and another to make them part of a real and genuine conversation that is going to result in actual change. And so I'm still waiting for that Oscar so white moment for the media. I think it's a long time coming, but the fact is that newsrooms have remained largely the same for the past 50 years. And that's something that we just cannot accept. And one good thing I think is that this is, to me, I feel like a real racial tipping point. We cannot go back. It's just like the pandemic. We can't go back to normal, as everyone says. The world has changed. And so you either get with it or you're going to get lost, because there is no kind of capitulating and getting around this topic. Like, things have to change in the media and things have to change in society.
I love that. I love that urgency. And I really hear that frustration that you're expressing. Thank you for being really real with us. I think we gain so much perspective when we hear that these are not new conversations and that we've been told the same platitudes for a while now, right? Primo, I'd love to bring you in the conversation and ask you, how do you see media and narratives impacting everyday lived realities of historically erased communities? Talk to us about erasure and what that looks like.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's a really great question. And I think to start off, I want to sort of touch on something that Kyra just mentioned in this idea of like representation in media. something that I'm constantly telling myself and reminding myself that's hard to remember is that representation is not always indicative of social progress. And I think that we see that really clearly in these past couple of years, where there is a huge presence of Black people in pop culture and the media. Hip hop and rap are a global cultural phenomenon right now. And yet we still see disproportionately high numbers of Black people dying in the streets. And so we see this disconnect between the representation of media, which we rely on as like a commentary on the social culture right now. We see this disconnect between representation and between the lived reality of Black people in this country. But it's not all tragic, because as a queer young person of color, non-binary person of color, I do know really truly in my life that representation can create positive impacts for marginalized communities, because there is power in seeing yourself represented in the media. When I watch shows on TV like One Day at a Time, Euphoria, Sense8, documentaries like Disclosure, even shows aimed at younger audiences like Steven Universe or She-Ra, and I see myself as like a person of color, as a queer person, reflected in these spaces like on TV that are being showed to people across the country, it validates my experience as a queer young person of color. Because if I was a little bit younger seeing that, I would see someone be like, oh, they look like me, they have the same feelings as me, they use the same pronouns as me. And that feeling of seeing yourself and being validated is really powerful. And I think it's something that we can really leverage in the media industry, because I think at the end of the day, we as humans like to connect and hear about the stories of other human beings. And that is essentially what media and journalism do. That is their job, is to foster that human connection. Just like Kyra was saying, it's the space where we meet each other when we can't meet each other physically. And so making sure that this space is one that is diverse and where everyone can meet everyone else, and it's not just two people meeting, I think is really the key to how representation and narrative in media can really make concrete impact in marginalized communities.
Incredible. Thank you for those reflections, Primo. Kyra, I wonder if you have some quick thoughts to this question as well. Would love to bring you back.
I do. First of all, I love everything Primo said. Makes 100% sense. You have to see yourself reflected back. And we take that, I think that white America really takes that for granted, because that's not an issue for them. And we really have to make sure that they understand that that's not acceptable. One thing I would like to point out, though, is that when we talk about representation, I think sometimes Americans think quantity over quality. They think that by bringing a bunch of people of color or people from underrepresented communities and tossing them out there, but still behind the scenes are the same people that were behind the scenes before. And they expect a different result. And that has never worked. Just simply, I call it stunt casting. You know how on sitcoms they bring in a big star and everyone goes, ooh, ah, and they try to bring up the ratings? That's what they're doing racially, like racial stunt casting. So I would like to ask Primo, actually, what do you think about that in terms of authentic portrayal? Is it important, do you think, to have more portrayal, or is it important to have authentic, or is it a both and? How do you think about that kind of question?
I think the future of media is really going to be, at least for our marginalized communities, is going to be navigating that balance between quantity and quality. And I think to offer maybe a solution to what you were just talking about, there are smaller media publications, media outlets that do provide that more authentic representation. And these are media outlets like them, like Gay Times, like Ebony, where you worked, that are, like you said, representative and diverse in front of and behind the camera, in front of and behind the screen. And so I think sort of deconstructing like this one dominant narrative where a lot of people get all of their media and their news from like a few discrete sources, I think diversifying not only the people in media, but where we are getting our media so that we can access those more authentic representations and narratives is really going to be key.
Awesome. I love that I'm hearing this theme from both of you, right? Like, you know, yes, representation is important, but please be cautious about authentic, nuanced representation that's really humanizing, right? It's never the same if there's a token person of color and they don't get to have a three-dimensional life and feelings and, you know, motivations like every other character. And I also love this other piece that you're sharing about, how we bring all of that together. So this next question is going to go back to you, Primo, again. Folks in this virtual audience really span a lot of ages, but I do know for a fact that we have other high school students, other college folks out there. So let's talk about that. How do you see younger folks, Gen Z in particular, plugging into this larger movement, right? I'm especially interested in the role of language and how it evolves over time, since language obviously informs the building of narratives and the building blocks of our stories. Would love to hear your thoughts, Primo, about being Gen Z and thinking about the evolution of language.
Yeah, I think to start off, I'll sort of address like the virtual elephant in the virtual room, being that my generation exists very largely on the internet and online. That is where we create and critique and work with a lot of our culture and social consciousness. It happens on social media, on the internet, on various platforms. And so I think that this is the first thing to recognize, is that this idea of the internet and our digital fluency, I think personally, I've recognized a higher capacity for change because there is sort of this accessibility that the internet has, where anyone can share their opinion. Anyone can make an Instagram account. Anyone, of course, like with access to the internet, and we have to keep that in mind as well. But there aren't as many limits as in like physical spaces as to who can share their opinion. And that is both positive and negative. I think we all are familiar with that sort of duality. But because there is this ease with which you can share your opinion and share your identity, it's easier for us to understand change because things are changing so quickly on the internet. And this speed of change we have sort of taken into our presence in the real world and in our everyday lives. And so to sort of speak to your question about language, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is pronouns. Like you look at us, we all have our pronouns in our presenter names today. People have their pronouns in their Instagram bios and their Twitter bios, in LinkedIn. And I think that, of course, we have to recognize that the work to get there, like Dr. Weber said earlier, we are standing on the backs of everyone who came before us and all of the queer activists. But I think the widespread normalization of the use of pronouns is really a direct result of queer and trans and non-binary people having a presence on the internet where they can use their pronouns and put that out there. And similarly, I think my generation has an interesting concept of intersectionality. And again, want to recognize that we didn't coin this term. It was coined by Miss Crenshaw, of course. But I think my generation is one of the first to really embrace this idea that we are all multiplicities, and our identities are created in various ways and in the intersections of our various core identifiers. And this is something that, at least in my circles, we're discussing very regularly. And in my work at YR Media, I'm able to write about that for other young people who are going to read that and hopefully relate to my intersectional experience. And so I think these two examples, like pronouns and then normalization of conversations around intersectional identity, are really amazing examples in my generation because, we're talking about language, and my generation has the right to critique the state of social consciousness around us. And I think one of the main ways we're doing that is through language.
I love that. Thank you so much, Primo. Kyra, I'd love to get your thoughts on this question too.
Yeah, I'd love to say, first of all, I salute Gen Z for that, because I came up during a time when your identity was something that you actually tried to either hide or mute so that you could fit into this mainstream ideal. So if you were a reporter, me coming to a story with my Blackness and my womanness was looked at as actually a flaw. And it was supposed to be incumbent upon me to figure out a way to take that out of the equation and be objective. But what I learned, and what I believe is true, is that when people are saying objective, what they mean is like a white male perspective, or what we call normal, which usually for them translates into whiteness and maleness. And I had to learn and train myself to fight against that I'm a legitimate journalist. I am someone who is really digging into the issues, and I'm being fair, but fair doesn't mean allowing like racists and bigots to be sources in story for balance. That's not balance. To provide a platform for someone who is making absolutely no sense and is being hateful and is full of vitriol. And I think that's a big mistake that this objectivity movement causes. And so I am grateful that we are considering intersectionality, that we are really questioning the way that we present and frame things, and not apologizing for being human beings and bringing our perspective, because I actually feel that's what makes your storytelling better, when you are able to bring that to the table versus trying to mute it or hide it and become some kind of plain milquetoast ideal that's been popularized for the last century or so.
Absolutely. I love your two voices in conversation there, right? Talking about how often we confuse objectivity, or we use the term objectivity, but what we're actually describing is this default of maleness and whiteness. I think that's so powerful and is really worth being called out from both of your perspectives. So we're running low on time. So this final question is going to be for both of you. What is the future you want to see for journalism and for media? Primo, let's start with you.
I'll offer a metaphor for this one. When you are casting a movie and you're making a movie and you have amazing POC, queer, trans, amazingly diverse actors in front of the camera, and they're playing their parts, they're telling their true stories, and they're acting, and it's amazing. But the producer, the director, the editors of that movie are white, cis, heterosexual, old men. We've essentially progressed nowhere. And so the future for media that I want to see is one where we can see an amazing diversity that reflects our lived experiences in front of and behind the camera. And I think that's something we mentioned earlier as well.
I love that. Thank you. Kyra, what about you? What is the future you want to see for journalism and media?
Why make me follow Primo's flawlessness, okay? Just floated over the beat with that one. I will just say that what I would like to see is the media being a mirror to society, and not a mirror to the privileged, and not a mirror to those who have held onto the microphone so tightly that their knuckles are white. We need to pass the microphone. We need to be equitable, and we need to be very thoughtful. And I think as I mentioned, we need to be able to bring our whole selves into the experience and really just make sure that the media is reflecting the people that it claims to serve.
Incredible. I love that. I want to be in that future with you both. And thank you both so much for joining us again. Kyra Kyles and Primo Lagaso Goldberg of YR Media. Thanks to you two.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Moving right along, our final speaker for this session is a personal shiro of mine. So this is really a dream come true. I'm deeply grateful to welcome to the virtual stage Fabiana Rodriguez. Favi is a deeply gifted interdisciplinary artist, cultural strategist, and social justice activist based in Oakland, California. Her art and praxis address migration, sexual freedom, gender justice, climate change, and racial equity. So I'm about to turn the stage over to Favi in a moment to speak to the role of arts and culture change. But first, I want to include one note. We're saving time at the end for audience Q&A with Favi. So please, at any point, drop questions in the Q&A function and hop in throughout Favi's comments. And we will pick them up through the chat and toss them to Favi after she wraps. Favi, handing it over to you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Fabiana Rodriguez. I'm an artist and activist and the founder and president of the Center for Cultural Power. And I really loved what Kyra and Primo had to share, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is so tied right into how culture shapes our imaginations and culture shows us what's possible. So as a visual artist, I tell stories through images. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some of my work, but also some of the kind of foundational ideas that inform the work of my organization, the Center for Cultural Power. And because I think, oftentimes we talk about culture change, narrative change, stories, and we don't always know what that means. And so I'm going to help give you some frameworks so that you understand the role of art, culture, media, and organizing in narrative change. So let's go ahead. Share my screen. Okay. Great. So culture is power. Culture shapes our understanding of the world around us. It shapes our ideas about ourselves, about each other, our relationship to the natural world, our relationship to all things, to gender, to race, and culture surrounds us all the time. It is like the ocean we swim in, and culture can shape us and we can shape culture. Now, it's important to note that culture is never neutral. Culture is always representing a point of view, and culture shapes our politics. It shapes our policies because as societies, we are shaped by particular myths and stories organize the way we then create our systems of governance and our systems of economics. And we are in the time of culture war. Culture is the battle for the imagination. And so as an artist, for a long time, I grew up thinking that art was cute, art was decorative, art was nice. But in reality, art is a necessity. It is a key way for us to build cultural power. And for me, as a young person, I grew up in Oakland, in East Oakland, during the era of the war on drugs. I hope you could all see, there's a picture of me here as a child. Sometimes the mirroring doesn't work well, so if you don't see that, please say something. This is me growing up, and it was the era of the war on drugs. And that severely impacted me because violence was so normalized, whether it was police violence or gang violence, or another kind of invisible violence, which is pollution, right? Living right next to the 880 freeway, which is one of the most polluted, the freeway that creates the most pollution. And art was a way for me to escape and to create another world for myself. And in art, I could go to places that I couldn't go to in real life. And luckily, I had two very supportive parents, immigrant parents, who put my art up everywhere. And although they didn't want me to be an artist, they wanted me to be a doctor because I was the first to go to college. But nevertheless, I dropped out of UC Berkeley and I became an artist in 2000. So I've been an artist for over 20 years. And what I always remember, my mentors were the Panthers, and I would hear about Nina Simone and James Baldwin. And yet I realized that we did not inherit a cultural infrastructure. My generation, although there was a vibrant Black arts movement and Chicano art movement, Native American art movement, my generation didn't get to necessarily benefit from cultural infrastructure. And that's largely because we, as a movement, were not able to really build one. And so that is why I'm committed to making sure that we build a vibrant infrastructure for artists and cultural workers, because we are not a nicety, we are a necessity. Now, a good metaphor to think about the power of stories and how is stories different from narratives and culture. So I'm going to give you something really useful, which is the narrative of the galaxy, right? So stories are like stars. They shine, and when you tell a story, whether it's a story about something that happened to you or you come out with your story creates a star. And stories inspire more stories. We saw this with Me Too. We know that Oscar Grant, who was killed just down the street in the Fruitvale BART by police, that when we can capture stories and we can elevate them, that we can help create movements. And so when stars shine, they inspire other stars to shine, and more stories come out. And when those stories become connected, they create a constellation. And that constellation is a narrative. It means that it is gaining momentum and we can see it, right? We can see a pattern that we did not see before. So it wasn't that sexual harassment and sexual abuse didn't exist 10 years ago. It's simply that we were not seeing it in the way we're seeing it now. And so narratives become so powerful that we can't ignore them. And that is narrative change. But culture is the whole galaxy, right? And so as artists, as creators, our role is to make sure there is a lot of stories, not just a few, a lot, because that is how we can help keep the zeitgeist alive, right? How do we make sure that these stars shine bright? Well, we keep telling more and more stories. Culture is a key lever of change. These are the realms in which change happens: culture, politics, and economics. And, I became an activist, Bay Area kid, became an activist when I was 15 years old, when Prop 187 was introduced. And that was the first state-based anti-immigrant state law, which, California began. The contemporary anti-immigrant movement began in this state. And I was a teenager, and I learned how to organize. I learned how to walk out my school, and was very active in the Schools Not Jails movement. I learned that it was about organizing in the streets. It was about calling your elected officials, showing up, occupying buildings. And that is very critical work. And culture shapes policies. That first we have to put out the idea, right? And I remember it was 1997 when Ellen DeGeneres first came out on TV, right? This was the first time that you had an LGBTQ character on television on a main network. And after that, of course, we saw Will and Grace, Queer Eye, shows like The L Word. Of course, these were very white, but nevertheless, you began to see the stories of queer folks in mainstream media, right? The Laramie Project, which was the story of Matthew Shepard. And it was 18 years later at the Supreme Court when marriage equity became a law. So we know that culture helps shape politics. It happens with everything. It happens with gun laws, with gender justice, right? We have been seeing trans folks on television for a long time, even before politics caught up, right? And so culture always moves faster than politics. And it's important that we be very forward-thinking, progressive, visionary with the culture we put out, because politics is the last to get in line. And partly it's because you have a lot of old white men who are attached to another worldview. And in culture is where we change worldview, right? Think about, what it means to hear the stories of the families whose loved ones were killed by the police, right? That's leading to culture change because we get to feel and understand the impacts of state violence. Or think about Undocumented and Afraid, right? The young people who came out with their stories around 2010 and 2 years later were able to win DACA. Culture is where we create the ideas and we normalize them. And economics falls in line pretty quick, but the world of politics takes a long time. And so in the world of culture, which is where I work as an artist, we need artists, filmmakers, musicians, DJs, performers, writers to be moving the culture. And when I was growing up as an activist, we overemphasized the political work. We didn't spend enough time in culture. And not just, it's been like that for many, many years. And so as a movement, we now have to build cultural power. And that means working in the cultural realm. It means working with creatives, and it means valuing the work that is about storytelling and about the imagination. So Me Too is an example I love to give, because Tarana Burke, who created the Me Too hashtag, in early 2018, January 2018, what we realized is no matter how rich and powerful you are, sexual abuse and harassment is normalized. It's actually normalized in the entire cultural industry, right? In the arts, in Hollywood. And it was farm worker women who wrote a letter to women in Hollywood and said, we need to be united, right? There's our sister Aijin right there, our sister Tarana, our sister Saju in the image in the top. And Me Too, remember how I talked about the stars? Me Too is about people sharing their stories, right? It was Rachel DeHollander who came out against Larry Nassar, the gymnast doctor who was abusing his patients. She came out, 250 stories followed. So our ability to speak our truth creates a mass movement. And that's so critical, so critical. This is some of my artwork. And, for 10 years, I used to do artwork that said no war, no borders, no hate. And I realized that I was really good at being about the no, but as artists, we can also be about the yes, right? I mean, we saw this with Wakanda in Black Panther. Like, we need our futurism. We need our yes. We need to know what moves us. And often we say, oh, we got to join the struggle. We got to join the fight. But we can't be fighting all the time. We also have to embrace our joy, our dignity, and be able to talk about the world we want to see, because that's how we normalize those ideas. This is a butterfly I created in 2012. Many of you have seen it. And it's about, honoring the fact that we are connected to nature. Nature has no borders, right? So borders are man-made, but nature, monarchs, the monarch butterflies, do not respect borders, and neither do fish and neither do birds. And we've been actually migratory creatures for hundreds of thousands of years. So this was an invitation to think about a world without borders. This is some of my work around gender equity. And, as an abolitionist and somebody who's experienced sexual violence, I believe we have to move towards repair. That to really have true gender justice, it's not just about building power, it's about creating infrastructure for repair and healing. Because I don't want to lock people up. I don't believe in putting people in cages. I believe in repairing and rehabilitating. And of course, is that so much of what the world of art and culture offer us is also an opportunity to engage in truth and reconciliation, to confront the wounds of the past and to heal from them, to document them. I mean, so much. I love that Isabel Wilkerson was a speaker, because that is our role, is to create a record, an object, a story, something that will live beyond us, that really truly captures our healing and what we do as a community. As an artist, I work in various mediums. I work in sculpture, murals, and in addition to that, of course, I run an organization which is a home for artists, because I believe that I had a really hard time being an artist. I didn't go to art school because the system of art making is a white supremacist system. White men have entrenched power in this world, and in a little bit, I'm going to give you some facts. So as an artist, I believe in opening doors to other artists, and I think we belong in social movements, and my organization is a bridge to create that. So in the final part of my presentation, I want to acknowledge that we are in the greatest cultural shift of our time, right? And this is a huge opportunity for us as people who create narratives, people who create culture, because never before as human beings have we been in a realm of culture shift as fast as what we're seeing now. So the stories of the past, the stories that held up this capitalist system, are revealed for what they are. And that is that these are lies. And Greta Thunberg talks about this. She says, fairy tales of endless growth. We can't live in the way that we live, like the inequality, what we're doing to the planet. Our systems of care are broken, and everybody knows it now around the world. And so our opportunity to talk about the future of care, the future of healthcare, the future of how we raise families. I mean, if you saw how many women left the workforce, right? Like, we have the way we value raising children needs to change. Care, right? And of course, we're in a moment of racial reckoning where we have the language to name what white supremacy is. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't have the language normalized. I love what Primo said about, yes, pronouns are culture change. And does it mean we have political change? Clearly not. I mean, we see what our government is doing against trans youth, but culture is moving, and culture at the end is going to win. Culture eats everything. There's that whole saying, it eats it all for breakfast. So we're in a moment, and we need to understand just how entrenched white supremacy is. We talked, the previous speakers talked about the media. It is everywhere. It is everywhere. And so when you're going to watch a movie and you're like, why is there so many white people in this movie? Why is everything so white? It's because of this. Because 96% of film directors are men, and 94% of executives are white, and they are presenting their fantasies, their narratives, their ideas are all coming out. So we're seeing the world through their eyes. And the art world is the same, right? 95% of museum art collections are by men. Like what? This is our cultural infrastructure. So we have to change this. And I believe that our social movements need to understand that this is also what we need to fight for, right? Not just the things we know, like education and addressing immigration policy. We have to address how the cultural industry works, because this is how they maintain their narrative power. And we cannot change hearts and minds if we don't have narrative power. And I love what Primo said. Representation is cute, but it is not power. It is not power. Power is leadership. Because really what it's about seeing the world through another lens, right? Seeing the world through the lens of a Black trans woman, of a disabled person, right? How do we experience the world and we get to be in their shoes? I mean, that is what culture is our ability to see different. And if we're only seeing through the lens of white men, then we have a problem. So but in closing, I'm telling you, my presentation just really mirrors what the previous speaker says. We're not going back. And let's think about a cocoon, because you can't go back to your old shape, right? How are we moving forward with different kinds of narratives? And finally, a plug for my city, Oakland. We are in the midst of a rebudgeting process. And, talk about culture change, right? Defunding the police is a culture change moment. And here in Oakland, we are embracing this. We as artists are getting organized, and we are going to successfully defund the police. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm excited for the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Favianna. I'm so glad that you were here today, and thank you for those case studies and those visuals, right? As well as your wisdom. I wrote down your comment, culture is where we create the ideas and normalize them. And I love that your focus was also on, not just the need to value arts and culture work on the same playing field as policy and politics, but also the necessity of, treating art as an industry. We need to build infrastructure, right, in order to actually transform an entire industry that has such power in the way we see ourselves and see what's possible. So let's get started. We've got some great questions that have come through. Thanks everybody for adding them. Keep adding them if you like. Our first one, Favi, is as a cultural strategist, what parts of our culture have you seen shift under this global pandemic? Would love your thoughts.
Yes. So the recognition of our mental health, the recognition that actually working is not enough, that you need friendships, you need systems of support, you need ways to manage conflict, right? Because as we saw, and actually, I mean, in reality, setting boundaries, I feel like talking about setting boundaries is such a culture shift, because in the past, of course, our parents didn't really have boundaries or didn't encourage them. But now the pandemic has made us realize how we show up for our families, our friends, and how we can stay healthy. The other thing is the reality of what happens if we get sick, right? Who takes care of us? What are our systems of care? What does our government do? Who pays for it? Who covers our time off? I also think our relationship to our home and our relationship to work, right? I think a lot of parents especially probably are like, wow, this is what it takes to raise a child. Like, I should be advocating for the rights of childcare workers. Like, why are these teachers getting paid so little? A recognition of what is truly the labor that helps keep our society moving and that replenishes us, but also helps us become, good children, good adults, good teenagers. I think the system of education, I have a lot of compassion for the young people and what they're experiencing, because honestly, our society doesn't really do much for young people. We love talking about young people, but the systems of support that young people have and will continue to have in this transition, we really have to examine that. And then finally, I would say that we absolutely need art and culture. Art and artists, 2/3 of artists are unemployed, y'all. The pandemic has devastated our industries. And, you know, who were the people keeping you entertained, giving you free drawing workshops, free poetry workshops, all of that. I feel like there's been a recognition for the powerful role that artists play.
I love that. And thank you for naming that, Favi. Yes, in case people have missed that, the arts industry has really, really been hit extremely hard by the pandemic at exactly the same point that we're realizing why the arts are so critical, right? For our sanity, our safety, our hearts and our minds and our spirits. Thank you for that. One question from the audience I'd love to give to you is, how can policy advocates better engage and partner with culture shapers to accelerate change?
Great question. So first, culture change is not communications. Culture strategy is not communication strategy. Communication strategy, often it's short-term, you're trying to win something. In culture change, you're trying to change the core ideas, right? So for example, if we're talking about gender justice, where are rom-coms, where are the films about trans love? We don't see them, right? Where is consent being shown back to us? So from a perspective of an organization, you have to think about what is the meta narratives that I'm trying to change, and how can I engage with artists? Well, first, do you have artists on your board? Do you have artists on your staff? Do you collaborate with artists? Do you partner with art institutions? So first, take an analysis, an audit of who are your cultural relationships and how you are sustaining those. Second, consider doing something like an artist in residence, you know, inviting an artist to collaborate on a campaign, recognizing though, an artist is not a designer. They're not just there to design your vision. Artists bring to the table their own ideas. And so you want to engage with the artists before you fully design your project, right? Let the artists bring their ideas. Think about what artists you want to work with. Do you want a visual artist, a comedian, a playwright, a dancer? And also, is the working with an artist internal to your organization or external? Because a lot of times an artist can come in and work with your members, a writing workshop like the National Domestic Workers did, a photographer who can photograph your members. Maybe you want a short video that tells the story of your work, right? Or do you want something that's external facing? Do you want something on your socials, right? Do you want your own content, maybe your own, you know, TikTok content? Experiment, but also know that we have to move away from one-off transactional relationships with artists where we just invite them to, you know, sing something or deliver a poem at your gala. That's not cultivating deep relationships. It's more like, how can you partner and really build relationships and also support artists? Like, how are you supporting artists as an organization?
I love that. Thank you. Thank you to all of that. Gosh, so many stories that we don't have time for, but yes, please stop treating arts as transactions and artists as transactional relationships. Nobody appreciates it. And I love your call out to, yes, like support artists, like find creative ways to work with them. And especially for artists of color. Thank you for those graphics that you showed earlier. Those were frustrating to see and also not surprising. All right, another question from our audience. Is defunding enough of a yes? Could there be a stronger vision for an alternative to policing, such as guardianship?
Yes. So first, I'm an abolitionist, and defund is the first step. I don't believe in a punishment, domination, punitive economy that keeps us safe. It just doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, putting people in cages does not transform them. It hurts them. It causes huge damage to our families, to our communities. So ideally, I want to move towards a place where we are not militarizing a force that is here to take care of us, but that instead we're investing in the services to keep our community safe, whether it's mental health, right, domestic violence services. I mean, if you look at our friend Kamau Bell did a wonderful show this past Sunday on CNN on United Shades of America. I was on that segment. It's all about how Oakland is working to defund the police, but he had a beautiful breakdown, which you could see on his socials. I mean, cops are not even really solving stuff. It's not like they're solving crime, right? They're not solving sexual assault. If you look at their rates of success, it is awful. So it's not like the reality is we're spending a lot of money. I mean, in Oakland, it's nearly half of the general fund on systems that don't work. And so if we can just move away, we are so ingrained with the idea that we don't touch the police, that people literally will not examine from a business perspective, that this is simply not working. So I believe in shifting to very specific ways of how we can address the issues in our community, whether it's the houselessness crisis or domestic violence, mental health crisis, etc. And that's, I believe that we can solve for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. All right, we've got one last question for you, Favianna, because I know we're coming up on time. And thank you to everybody who's been dropping them in the chat. We won't be able to get to all of them. We'll send them afterwards to Favi if you would like that, Favi. And yes, people definitely check out Favi's work, support artists. There's so many BIPOC artists that really need some love and support and are doing incredible, profound work. Our final question for you today, Favi, is Black writer and activist Toni Cade Bambara reminds us that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. One of my favorite quotes of all time. Favi, what do you see as the role of arts and culture in activating people? And more importantly, what is the revolution you hope to make irresistible through your art and activism? Let's go.
Yes, the hope I hope to make visible is that our revolution needs to be joyful, it needs to be pleasurable, it needs to replenish us. And we have to release this idea that it's going to hurt, it's going to be a struggle, it's going to be a fight, because that's the colonial mindset. Pain-oriented narratives is how we have been ruled and oppressed. But when we tap into our joy and our resilience and we take time to rest, to recuperate, to build our relationships to each other, to unlearn the colonial mindset, because it's not just what's happening out here, it's what's happening in here and here in our bodies. When we do that in a full transformative ways, we can be even more powerful. So my vision is a joyful, pleasurable, interconnected, nature-based, earth-inclusive revolution where we are leading in a way that is regenerative and not extractive.
Apologies, I was so much I forgot to unmute. That was amazing. So thank you so much for that call to action, Favi, and thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really a gift.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Incredible. Well, I'm going to start closing us out because I know we are at 10:30 on the dot. So let's see how this goes. I think I can confidently call that the fastest hour of my life and an absolute honor. I love how Kyra talked to us about, right, these histories of intentional erasure and the impacts on historically erased communities, a very important reframe, as well as the racial reckoning that she thinks is long overdue for the media industry in particular. I love how Primo called for a diversity of decision makers in creative spaces, just like what we ask for in policy spaces. And I love how they gave breath to the creativity from Gen Z, picking up the torch from aged millennials like myself. When it comes to language, when it comes to arts, when it comes to journalism. And finally, this profound call to action from Favi herself to remind us of all the times that we have dared to change the world and the momentum that she hopes that we carry forward from here. In her own words, we are not a nicety, we are a necessity. So I love, love, love that piece around, don't sleep on the role of arts and culture. Like arts and culture is a container that lets all of the other things that we care about happen. So with that, my final task here is to welcome back to the virtual stage my friends and comrades, Rodney and Mercedes. So I'm handing it over to you, Rodney and Mercedes.